What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Nikephoros II Phokas from 963 to 969 CE. Nikephoros II Phokas was the Byzantine emperor. Nikephoros, also known as the White Death of the Saracens, was a fearsome commander who conquered much of Syria, Crete, and Cilicia. While he is known as a great military commander, he was a poor politician, and his reign was cut short by his murder. Military career. The Phokas were a powerful military family from which Nikephoros was born. Nikephoros' parents, uncle, and grandfather were all high-ranking military officers, and he was raised to be a soldier and general in a similar way. Constantine VII made Nikephoros the strategos or governor-general of the Anatolikon theme, a significant Byzantine province. In 955 CE, Nikephoros succeeded his father Bardas in taking command of the Byzantine armies. After Nikephoros took command, he resumed his father's war with Sef al-Dawla R, the Muslim ruler of much of Syria from 945 to 967 CE, and the Byzantine Empire's greatest adversary at the time. The Abbasid Caliphate only existed in Baghdad, and strong men ruled a lot of the Middle East. During the 950s CE, Sef al-Dawla's Hamdanid dynasty ruled large portions of Syria and Iraq. He also led numerous campaigns against the Byzantine Empire. Bardas, the father of Nikephoros, had fought Sef on multiple occasions but was unsuccessful. A multi-pronged offensive and raids on Sef's and his allies' territories in Cilicia were part of Nikephoros' strategy. The strategy utilized two land offensives under Nikephoros' nephew, John Tsimisks, and his brother Leo Phokas, as well as the naval commander Basil Hexamelites. Sef suffered a series of defeats which undermined his authority, and the Byzantine army captured the major cities of Hadath and Samosata. However, despite Cilicia and Syria laying open to Byzantine attack, Constantine VII r. 913 to 959 CE and his successor Romanos II r. 959 to 963 CE directed Nikephoros to command the reconquest of Crete in 960 CE. Byzantine conquest of Crete in the 820 CE by Arabs from Spain opened the door to devastating Aegean raids, and the Byzantines had failed 5 times to retake the island. Crete was a major sticking point for Byzantium. After breaking through the walls of Chondax, Nikephoros was able to conquer Crete in 961 CE thanks to his superior numbers and scare tactics, which saw him launch the heads of dead Arabs into the city. Abd al-Aziz B, the defeated Cretan emir, was Shu'aib al-Qurtubi, and his son were captured, and Nikephoros celebrated a Roman triumph back in Constantinople. Nikephoros then turned back to the east and attacked Cilicia and then Syria. In 962 CE, he toppled Anazarbos and then Hierapolis, which is now Manbij. He looted Aleppo, the capital of Sef al-Dawla, at the end of the year. Sef faced internal rebellion for the next 5 years while Nikephoros received news that Romanos II had died. When Nikephoros celebrated his triumph in Constantinople for his victory at Aleppo, Joseph Bringas, Romanos' chief administrator, forced Nikephoros to swear loyalty to Romanos' 2 young sons, Basil and Constantine, the scions of the Macedonian dynasty. Ascend to power Nikephoros was sent back to Cappadocia to lead the army against Syria once again, but his troops proclaimed him emperor. His forces marched on Constantinople, where Bringas became increasingly unpopular. Crowds of Constantinopolitans gathered to protest and voice their support for Nikephoros, and in response, Bringas ordered the city's bakers to stop baking bread. This only fanned the flames of Bringas' unpopularity and led to riots, which were strengthened when Basil Lekipinos, the former chief administrator of Constantine VII, paid 3,000 men to join the protesters. Bringas fled, and Nikephoros entered the city to popular acclamation by the people. The Patriarch of Constantinople then crowned Nikephoros co-emperor with a young future Basil II r. 976-1025 CE and Constantine VIII r. 1025 to 1028 CE. However, the implicit agreement was that Nikephoros would protect Basil and Constantine and rule in their stead, not found a new dynasty. Bardas, Nikephoros' elderly father, was made Caesar, rather than the Byzantine Empire's heir apparent, which was more of an honorific. He also appointed his nephew, John Tzimiskes, to be domestikos or commander of the East and appointed his brother Leo to logothetes or administrator of the state finances. Meanwhile, Bringas was exiled to Paphlagonia while Basil Lekipinos was rewarded for his support and was appointed Parakoimaminos, the administrator of the palace, which was the position he had held under Constantine VII. Later in 963 CE, Nikephoros married Theophano, the widow of Romanos II, to further legitimize his reign but also to better protect the young princes, Basil and Constantine. However, Polyeuctos, the Patriarch of Constantinople, objected, pointing out that Nikephoros had been Basil or Constantine's godfather, making him the same as a biological parent in the eyes of the Church. The marriage was eventually confirmed, but Nikephoros and Polyeuctos were still at odds. Personal characters: Nikephoros was a highly devout man and brought Christian relics from his conquests back to Constantinople. Nikephoros believed in a highly ascetic form of Christianity, however, and criticized the Church for becoming wealthy. One source claims that Nikephoros even demanded that soldiers who were killed in combat with Muslims be honored as martyr Skylitzes 274-75. Nikephoros had ascetic traits including vegetarianism, and he wore a hair shirt under his armor and robes, and he slept on a bearskin he had received from his uncle, who was a saint. Theophano, on the other hand, was famous for her beauty and was interested in the finer things in life. They were not an ideal match, and it is unclear whether it was a marriage in name only. Nikephoros only had one son from a previous marriage, but he had tragically died in a hunting accident. Nikephoros had thick hair, was dark, and was tall. The German ambassador Liutprand of Cremona provided one of the most well-known images of any Byzantine emperor. Liutprand described Nikephoros as follows. Nikephoros was a quite monstrous man, dwarfish, with a fat head and mole-like by virtue of the smallness of his eyes, deformed by a short beard that is wide and thick and graying, disgraced by a finger-like neck, quite like Hyopas because of the abundance and thickness of his hair, in color quite like the Ethiopian whom you would not like to run into in the middle of the night. Campaigns. After securing the throne, it did not take long for Nikephoros to resume his wars against the Muslims. In 964 CE, Nikephoros sent a fleet to seize back Sicily from the Fatimids. However, in 965 CE, the Fatimids seized the island's final Byzantine strongholds after an ambush by Byzantine forces resulted in their complete defeat. In 967 CE, Nikephoros sued for peace with the Fatimids and abandoned Sicily to Muslim rule. Meanwhile, the forces of the Emir of Tarsus in Cilicia had raided Byzantine lands while Nikephoros was making a bid for the throne in Constantinople and securing his rule. Now Nikephoros came back with a vengeance. In 964 CE, John Tzimiskes set fire to the outskirts of the major Cilician cities. A few months later, Nikephoros, Theophano, Basil, and Constantine showed up in person. In 964 CE, Nikephoros conquered Adana and Anazarbos. Over the course of more than 2 centuries, the island's revenues were equally divided between Byzantine and Arab control. When a fleet led by Niketas Chakoutzes expelled the Arabs in 965 CE, Nikephoros re-established complete Byzantine control. Nikephoros conquered Cilicia following his victory over Cyprus, which he celebrated in Constantinople once more. Byzantine naval power once more extended across a significant portion of the Mediterranean Sea with the retaking of Crete, Cyprus, and Cilicia. In 966 CE, Nikephoros marched his army east into Syria but achieved no real benefits. However, Syria erupted into civil wars and became extremely fragmented after Sef al-Dawlah's death in 967 CE. In 967 or 968 CE, the Armenian princes of Taran ceded the small Armenian state to Nikephoros in exchange for lands and titles within the Byzantine Empire, pushing the Byzantine frontier further to the east. In 968 CE, Nikephoros returned to Syria and conquered the important port city of Laodicea by marching as far south as Tripoli, which is now in modern-day Lebanon. He then built a fortress to block off Antioch, one of the former greatest cities of the Byzantine Empire, before returning to Constantinople. Antioch fell to Byzantine forces in 969 CE. Domestic affairs. His subjects dubbed Nikephoros the terrifying White Death of the Saracens because of his consistent success against the Arabs, also known as Saracens. But while Nikephoros was a military hero, as emperor he alienated several powerful segments in Byzantine society, undermining his rule and legacy. He dealt with criticism tactfully, arranged the state finances to prioritize army funding, and promoted the interests of soldiers. To pay for his wars, Nikephoros increased taxes, most of which probably went to his own class, the Anatolian military elite. To boost the state's finances, he introduced the Tartaron, a gold coin that was temporarily devalued. In 964 CE, Nikephoros forbade endowments for new monasteries and gifts to existing ones. He did this because Nikephoros wanted to boost the state's tax revenue and church lands were exempt from taxation. However, this action demonstrated the growing gap between the people and the ruler. In Constantinople, popular discontent was high by 967 CE. Armenian soldiers and citizens of Constantinople got into a fight over Easter, and several people died as a result. Nikephoros began to be pelted with stones by members of the public. Religion and foreign policy. Meanwhile, Nikephoros was unraveling Byzantium's foreign relations. Tsar Peter R. and Bulgaria had been Orthodox Christians for a century. She was married to Romanos I.R. from 927 to 969 CE, granddaughter between 920 and 944 CE, and was thus related to the Byzantine royal family through marriage. But there was some sort of falling out between Nikephoros and Peter, and Nikephoros paid the Rus leader Sviatoslav R. to raid Bulgaria in 945 to 972 CE. In 968 CE, Sviatoslav conducted an extensive raid into Bulgaria. Peter passed away the following year, leaving a weak Tsar Boris II. Between 969 and 971 CE, Byzantium was confronted with a ferocious Rus army and a crumbling Bulgarian state. Nikephoros' relationship with Holy Roman Emperor Otto I of Germany was also contentious. German king from 936 to 973 CE. Holy Roman Emperor from 962 to 973 CE. In 968 CE, Otto the Great invaded southern Byzantine Italy in pursuit of the entire peninsula. Otto also allied himself with the Lombard dukes of southern Italy, traditional enemies of the Byzantines. The bleak relationship between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire can be seen in Nikephoros' encounters in Constantinople with Otto's ambassador, Liutprand of Cremona, who appeared to despise Nikephoros. Although Otto's troops continued to conduct extensive raids into Byzantine southern Italy, they failed to effectuate any significant change in the status quo. Additionally, Nikephoros collaborated with the Jacobite Syrian Church, a Monophysite church opposed to orthodoxy and the Patriarchate of Constantinople. He initially stated that if their leader, Yohanan VII, moved to Cappadocia, they would be free to practice their religion. However, in 969, Nikephoros brought Yohanan to Constantinople, forced him to debate doctrinal issues, and exiled him and other leaders of the Syrian Church for refusing to accept orthodoxy. Death and legacy. John Tsimisks, who Nikephoros had placed under house arrest sometime after 965 CE, was hoisted into the palace by his co-conspirators on December 10 and 11, 969 CE, possibly with Empress Theophanos' support. John Tsimisks and his co-conspirators broke into Nikephoros' sleeping chambers and murdered the sleeping Nikephoros. Nikephoros' deep unpopularity made him only mourned among the military. One of Nikephoros' soldiers praised the deceased emperor as the general of invincible Rome, a king by nature, a bringer of victories. In fact, Geometers, 283. In fact, Nikephoros was one of the greatest generals of the Byzantine Empire. Despite the fact that he was not politically savvy, the Byzantine Empire rose to new heights of strength thanks to his exceptional martial skills. Although Nikephoros II Phokas' ascension to the Byzantine throne in 963 CE marked the culmination of a spectacular military career and the temporary victory of the Anatolian military aristocracy over the Constantinopolitan bureaucracy, His reign would ultimately be doomed by a profound inability to navigate the perilous political and social currents of the imperial capital, which would result in his brutal murder and the subsequent erasure of his legacy. Born into the powerful Phokas clan, a family whose name was synonymous with martial prowess and command on the eastern frontiers, Nikephoros was bred for war, not for courtly intrigue. His worldview was shaped in the rugged landscapes of Cappadocia and the brutal campaigning seasons against the Hamdanid emir of Aleppo, Sef al-Dawla, not in the gilded halls of the great palace. His father, Bardas Phokas, and uncle, the legendary general Nikephoros Phokas the Elder, were his templates, and from them he inherited not only a command but a sacred duty: the relentless prosecution of the Byzantine Reconquista against the Muslim powers that had chipped away at the empire's territories for centuries. It was a recognition of both his own emerging talents and the influence of his family when Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos appointed him strategos of the Anatolikon theme, the empire's largest and most crucial military district. When his father died in 955 CE, he was given full command of the eastern armies and the task of finally defeating Sef al-Dawla, the empire's most formidable and persistent enemy. Sef al-Dawla was a poet prince whose Ghazi raids deep into Byzantine Anatolia had made him a figure of both fear and resentment. The coordinated, multi-front warfare that Nikephoros used to defeat the Hamdanids was a demonstration of his strategic genius. Nikephoros, in contrast to previous campaigns, pursued a methodical strategy of attrition and conquest rather than relying on massive raids. Delegating command to his most dependable lieutenants, he orchestrated a pincer movement. His brother, Leo Phokas, and his brilliant ambitious nephew, John Tsimisks, led devastating land offensives, and naval commander Basil Hexamolites hounded the Cilician coast, preventing reinforcements and disrupting supply lines. A string of remarkable victories resulted from this unrelenting pressure. Sef al-Dawla's authority and prestige were severely undermined by the capture of the fortified cities of Hadith and Samosata, longtime enemies of the empire. A full-scale invasion that promised to reclaim lands that had been lost for generations lay open on the roads into Cilicia and northern Syria. However, Constantinople's directive was to turn west toward the sea rather than taking advantage of the advantage in the east at this crucial moment. The island of Crete, under Arab control since the 820s, was a nest of pirates whose raids perpetually threatened the Aegean heartland of the empire, crippling trade and terrorizing coastal populations. The humiliating failure of 5 previous attempts to retake it was the result. The symbolic and strategic reward of Crete outweighed any additional gains in Syria for Emperors Constantine VII and Romanos II, who succeeded him. In 960 CE, Nikephoros was ordered to redirect his formidable army and besiege Chandax, modern Heraklion. Nikephoros' determination and willingness to use psychological terror were demonstrated by the exhausting Cretan campaign. The siege was a bloody war of attrition that lasted into the winter of 961 CE. Nikephoros, ever the innovator in siege warfare, utilized his superior numbers to tighten a noose around the city. To break the defender's will, he resorted to a horrifying tactic. He ordered the heads of slain Arab warriors catapulted over the city walls, a grim message that promised no quarter. The walls were finally breached as a result of this brutal psychological warfare and persistent military pressure. The emir of Crete, Abd al-Aziz ibn Shuaib, and his son were captured, and the island was swiftly brought back under imperial control after over 130 years of Arab rule. Nikephoros' greatest accomplishment to date was retaking Crete, a feat that had eluded his predecessors for more than a century. The captured emir and his son were paraded through the streets alongside massive displays of plunder and the victorious army during Nikephoros' triumphant return to Constantinople, establishing him as the empire's foremost hero. However, his thoughts were already returning to the pending issues in the east. Almost immediately, he returned to the front, launching a devastating invasion of Cilicia in 962 CE. His armies took the great cities of Anazarbos and Hierapolis, Manbij. The sack of Aleppo, the glittering capital of Sef al-Dawla, marked the climax. Though the citadel held out, the city was looted, its treasures seized, and its prestige shattered. Sef al-Dawla, already ailing and now broken by this final humiliation, would succumb to internal rebellion soon after. Nikephoros was unrivaled as a conqueror and the undisputed ruler of the eastern Mediterranean. When the news of Emperor Romanos II's sudden death broke, he was at his most powerful. The only young sons the emperor left behind were Basil and Constantine, who became co-emperors under the regency of the powerful and cunning court eunuch Joseph Bringas. Nikephoros was tricked into going to Constantinople to celebrate Aleppo's latest victory. Fearing the general's enormous popularity and power, Bringas attempted to neutralize him by compelling him to swear a public oath of loyalty to the young Macedonian princes. Nikephoros, ever the loyal soldier, complied and was sent back to Cappadocia. But the seeds of suspicion had been sown. Not content, Bringas continued his plot against the Phokas family. For Nikephoros and the devoted army that adored him, this was the last straw. The troops, led by his nephew John Tzimiskes, made Nikephoros emperor in Caesarea. Rather than a civil war, Nikephoros' allies skillfully orchestrated a populist uprising to support a calculated march on the capital. In a catastrophic error, Bringas instructed the city's bakers to stop making bread in an effort to quell the growing pro-Phokas demonstrations. Instead, he started a complete riot. The situation was masterfully exploited by another political player, the wily eunuch Basil Lekipinos, who paid thousands to join the protests, sealing Bringas's fate. The regent fled, and Nikephoros entered Constantinople not as a conqueror but as a liberator, acclaimed by the people and the army. The patriarch Polyeuctos, though wary, crowned him co-emperor alongside the young Basil and Constantine, formalizing a regency that everyone understood would see Nikephoros wield sole power. His first act as king was to carefully strike a balance between upholding the legitimacy of the Macedonian dynasty and rewarding his family while simultaneously securing his position. Bardas, his elderly father, received the prestigious but primarily ceremonial title of Caesar. His brother Leo was put in charge of the state finances as Logothetes II Genikou, and his nephew John Tzimiskes was made domesticos of the schools of the East, commander-in-chief of the Eastern armies. He married the beautiful and ambitious Empress Theophano, the young prince's mother, to strengthen his ties to the previous regime and establish his legitimacy as their guardian. However, this action sparked an angry argument with Patriarch Polyeuctos right away. The strict moralist patriarch pointed out that Nikephoros had been one of the children's godfathers, making him their spiritual father. Because of this, the church considered a marriage to the children's biological mother to be incestuous. A bitter standoff ensued, only resolved when a penitent Nikephoros agreed to a humiliating public penance, a stark indication of the limits of imperial power when confronted with staunch ecclesiastical authority. The marriage went ahead, but the rift with the powerful Orthodox Church never fully healed, a critical weakness in his political armor. Nikephoros the emperor was a paradox, a man whose personal life was one of extreme asceticism in stark contrast to the grandeur of his office. He was, at his core, a soldier monk. He was a devout Orthodox Christian who practiced a severe, almost monastic form of piety. He slept on a bearskin rug that his saintly uncle had given to him, was vegetarian, and wore a shirt with coarse hair underneath his armor and imperial silks. His fervent belief that fallen soldiers should be honored as martyrs for Christ endeared him even more to his troops, but the clergy were puzzled. This asceticism clashed profoundly with the culture of the court and with his own wife Theophano, who was renowned for her beauty, love of luxury, and sophisticated tastes. Their marriage was likely one of political convenience and was famously unhappy, a source of gossip and tension. He was called a monstrous man, dwarfish with mole-like eyes and a neck like a bull, by the insulted Lombard bishop Liutprand of Cremona.